Good evening. It is my tremendous pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you so much, School for Advanced Research folks, particularly Michael and Meredith, for inviting me to come and talk with you about Chaco. And thank you so much, Linda Cordell. I am beyond honored to be the inaugural Linda Cordell speaker at SAR. Linda was a tremendous mentor and supporter and friend to me as a young scholar, and I have chosen to show you her SAR resident scholar photo there because, as probably a lot of you know, those photos of former resident scholars hang on the walls of the billiard house at SAR. And when I was a resident scholar, some decades after Linda, and was feeling particularly pressed for inspiration, usually around 2 in the morning or so, we had keys to the billiard house, and I would wander down there and I would commune with the pictures on the wall, and I would look up at Linda Cordell and think, wow, you know, if only I can someday do something that approaches some of the tremendous contributions that she's made to Southwest archaeology. So I know I'll never actually fill Linda's shoes, but I am just tremendously honored to be speaking as part of this series. I also want to start my talk tonight by acknowledging that we're standing here in Santa Fe on the occupied lands of indigenous peoples, of Tewa, Tiwa, Towa, Carriz and speakers. Our Dene friends are just down the road. And it's very important for us to remember that, particularly when we're talking about something like Chaco Canyon, which is, of course, an ancestral place for our indigenous friends and colleagues today. How many of you have been to Chaco Canyon? Oh, awesome. Okay, keep your hands up, keep your hands up. How many of you haven't been yet but want to go? Okay, that's pretty much the entire house, so I can go home, because you already know everything there is to know about Chaco. Now, what I plan to do tonight, this is a little bit different from kind of my usual crowd. I'm often giving this talk in places like Toledo, where I have to spend a lot of time explaining to people like what a desert is, things like that. But I don't have to do that for you. So what I plan to do is just really briefly kind of review pretty pictures of Chaco. Let's all remember what's going on there. And then I'm going to give you just a little glimpse into some of my earlier work there that was already mentioned, the book that I was working on as a scholar here a couple decades ago now, ouch. But that got me really thinking a lot about visibility and about the human experience of place and why I think those things are important. Then I'll tell you about some current work, and then the last part of the talk I will segue into the political part, how I got involved in what could probably be accurately construed as political activism on the Chaco landscape. So we'll start in Chaco Canyon today, a national park, which of course attracts all of us with its monumental architecture, and it's certainly held tourists and archaeologists alike in thrall for over a century, and it's been an important place for much longer than that. You all know that great houses like Pueblo Bonito here are monumental edifices that are several stories high and that are very planned in their layout and organization, almost symmetrical. And you know that there are quite a few of these in downtown Chaco, depending on how you count, 11, 12 great houses in downtown Chaco Canyon. You also probably know that there are other kinds of monumental edifices in Chaco. There are Great Kivas. This one is actually in the plaza of Pueblo Bonito, but there are a number of Great Kivas. I think the last time I tried to count, 17 total, because many are unexcavated, but they're on the south side of the canyon. They're associated with plazas of great houses, and they're also monumental and very symmetrical and very planned in their layout and in their construction. So of course these things have attracted archaeologists and artists and tourists and a national park. Other kinds of monumental work in Chaco Canyon includes the infamous roads. My good friend and colleague Anna Sofer is here tonight, and I believe that you had a wonderful lecture from her and part of her team, Rich Friedman and Rob Weiner, last fall. Was it? Not too long ago. So you probably know a lot about Chaco Roads right now from their excellent research. But just to remind you, the roads are there, cleared linear alignments that extend out in various directions into the desert landscape. But of course, Chaco wasn't just about monuments. People also lived there. So let's not forget that we have upwards of 200 small habitation sites in and around the canyon, where people obviously were living. These are domestic. Doesn't mean people didn't also live in great houses, and I think they probably did at least some of the time in some of the great houses, but certainly there's lots of people living in Chaco Canyon. It's not empty. It's a farming community. Chaco lasted about 300 years, or the part of Chaco that we talk about and that we try to pull apart as kind of a special place, lasted about 300 years. And I'm not going to read this to you, but just to kind of remind you, it starts in the mid-800s, and domestic structures eventually become great houses. By kind of prime time Chaco, the classic Bonito phase, we're in the 1000s and into around 1100. And that's the time when, in the estimation of a lot of us, maybe not all of us, but a lot of us, we think that Chaco was a center place, a place that gathered a lot of people together for various kinds of events, probably ceremonial in nature, at least some of them. And so things are flowing into the canyon, and that's the period when a lot of monumental architecture is being constructed. And then, of course, we have a late Bonito phase that goes into the 12th century, where it might have been a time when Chaco tried to expand and it didn't fully work, and eventually we have collapse. Although Chaco never really goes away, because Chaco's resonance and the stories, the oral traditions, and the ideas about Chaco are still very much present and alive in the traditions and the histories of indigenous descendant communities today, of course. But Chaco Canyon doesn't stop. Chaco doesn't stop at the borders of the canyon or the borders of the National Monument, and I think you guys probably all know that. There's a huge world out there of outliers. Now, this word outliers may be a little unfortunate because it implies a statistical outlier, but these sites were dubbed outliers in, I believe, the 70s by Chaco Center archaeologists who were exploring around, and we knew that there were more big sites out there that looked kind of like Chaco, but they started actually finding them, tagging them, mapping them. People like Mike Marshall, John Stein, Steve Lexon were out running around the San Juan Basin and documenting these outliers. So today, depending on how we count, there are maybe about 200 sites, and you see all the dots there. You probably can't read the letters on the names of places, and that's okay, but you can see all the dots, and you can see just how far-flung this Chaco world is. It goes all the way up into southern Colorado, southeast Utah, eastern Arizona. This is an area that is, depending again on exactly where you want to put a boundary, between 30,000 and 60,000 square miles, or in other words, about the size of the state of Alabama. So it's a big place, right? And of course, we know everything there is to know about these outliers, right? Wrong. I mean, we know a lot about some of them, and some of them are really dramatic and impressive. And in fact, Quinbiniola, how many of you have been to Quinbiniola? Anybody? So if you haven't been, you should go. It's part of the park, and so, well, when the dam that you have to drive across to get to it isn't washed out, which happens all too frequently, you can go there. And this multi-storied, very planned, very symmetrical looking edifice would feel right at home in downtown Chaco. So some of the outliers have great houses that look like this. Many more of them, though, have great houses that look like this, a big rubble mound. Now, if we were to walk around on it or to actually excavate it, we would see rooms, we would see maybe multiple stories here, and we would see something that looks very planned. But this is more what a lot of outliers have been mapped as. We know that there's a big rubble mound that's almost certainly a great house. Outliers often also have Great Kivas in association with them, and they often have surrounding communities. But out of that 200 or so in the outlier universe, we have a really good understanding with really good maps and really good information about the whole community, about maybe like 15, would you say? I mean, there's a lot of Chaco scholars in the audience, so feel free to jump up and correct me if I grossly misspeak, but there are many, many outliers that we really just know they're there. Here's one that we happen to know a lot about, and this is a shout out to my recent PhD, Dr. Kellum Throgmorton, who did work mapping an outlier community. Actually, he mapped several, but this is one called Morris 40, and we used magnetometry, actually, to identify where a lot of the surrounding community sites were. There were a lot of buried features, and you can see that this is a really big community here. The Great House is actually up in the kind of upper left-hand side of the slide where the road segments are leading. But you can see that there's a lot going on there. So imagine that in the world of outliers, there's a few that we know this much about, but there are many, many more that we basically just know they're there. And they're still waiting for us to come and study them and think about them and try to understand what was happening in those communities and then how those communities related to what was going on in Chaco Canyon. Here's your map again, so just to remind you how many there are. So in the various models to try to explain or understand what was happening in Chaco Canyon that made it so special, that allowed so much monumental architecture to be built in such a kind of a tight space. I think the one that most of us agree on, and again, not all of us, but the one that most of us Chaco scholars agree on, has the outliers playing a pretty critical role. The outliers are where a lot of people are living, and those people are coming into Chaco Canyon upon occasion. And maybe they're coming to contribute their labor to the construction of those great houses or those monumental edifices. Maybe they're coming to Chaco Canyon to participate in various ritual events. We certainly have plenty of evidence that special things happened at Chaco. We have certainly many places in Chaco, like the Great Kivas, where almost certainly important ceremonies took place. So maybe they're coming for that. Maybe they're coming around solar and lunar events. And here again, my colleague Anna Sofer has done tremendous work that first demonstrated to us that solstices and equinoxes and lunar standstills are a thing in Chaco. They're very clearly marked in Chaco. And so this is something pretty special, and maybe people were coming to observe that. Maybe people were coming to Chaco because Chaco is where the ancestors are. Chaco Canyon actually has a long history of occupation that even predates the 800s, and there are sites like this one that I'm showing you that's much earlier. It's a Basket Maker 3 village, and there's actually a classic Benito period, so that's 1000s, J-shaped feature on top of one of the houses that show us that, yeah, people are marking this place as special. There's lots of other evidence for ancestors being important at Chaco as well, so maybe that's what was attracting them there. But another thing I think that's really important in attracting people to Chaco, and one of the reasons why Chaco emerges as a really important spot, has to do with cosmography, and it has to do with the landscape itself. So as I was working on landscape and thinking about Chaco as a place, and this maybe 20 years ago or so, I was also reading a lot of ethnography and talking to a lot of colleagues who were Pueblo or who were Diné, and thinking about how for a lot of indigenous people, maybe all indigenous groups who live in and around the Colorado Plateau, directions are really important, and a center place is really important. So you have north, south, east, west, and maybe up and down being marked as directions. And maybe they're not literally marked. Sometimes they are literally marked, but it's important to think about you in the village or in the Pueblo or in the place surrounded by mountains or surrounded by markers that indicate that there are these directions and that you are kind of tying them all together. And I think that that's something that the canyon, it actually does. If you think about it, you think Chaco Canyon, okay, so it's a canyon, but actually it's a canyon that cuts through Chakra Mesa, which is a high place in the middle of the big dish-shaped depression of the San Juan Basin. And if you're up on a high place in or around Chaco Canyon, and if you've hiked up to Pueblo Alto or San Cleton, you know this, you can look out and you can actually see that the basin is ringed by these really distinctive looking high places. Now, all the ones in the photo here you can't actually see from Chaco Canyon, but most of them you can. And the ones that you can't see, like I've got Chimney Rock there, it's actually linked back to Chaco by line of sight by Huerfano Mesa, which you can see from Chaco, which is on top there. So the very topography of the canyon seems to be kind of resonating with ideas that are still felt really strongly in the indigenous world. So that's a lot of speculation, but I think it's also something that we see the Chacoans then taking and running with. My colleague Mike Marshall, who did a lot of work with Anna, came up with a recognition that I felt like was right on and really important, that we have major roads leading out of Chaco Canyon, and you probably all know that there's a north road that goes about 50 kilometers or so due north, and then there's a south road that goes to the south-southwest out of Chaco. Those are the two longest road segments that we have, but those two road segments, they balance Chaco Canyon as kind of the fulcrum between north and south because they're kind of the same length and they're going in those two directions. And they also, and this was Mike's insight, they also seem to go to a down place or Coots Canyon in the north and an up place or a high place or Hasta Butte, which is where the south road is pointing to the south-southwest. So if you wanted to here, you could think about Chaco Canyon as pointing to the east and west itself. You know, it's not not perfect, but it's kind of east-ish, west-ish. And then you have north and south as clearly really important directions in Chaco. And this is something that also was recognized by folks like Steve Lexon and John Fritz. I mean, there's no disputing, I think, that north is an important direction. But the Chacoans seem to be inscribing onto the landscape itself with the construction of these roads that Chaco's in the center, and it's balanced. You also see this in the architecture itself. For example, think about a great house next to a Great Kiva. The Great House is highly visible, it's going up into the sky, it's a high place. The Great Kiva is semi-subterranean, subterranean, roofed over, hidden, not visible, it's going down, it's a low place. So this is what I talked about in this book, which was mentioned earlier and that I was working on in my time as a resident scholar at SAR. And I talk about a lot of other lines of evidence besides these, and I tried to draw them all together and argue that I think during Chaco's heyday, when people were coming into Chaco from the outlier communities, the whole landscape and the buildings were orchestrated so that people would have a spatial experience of Chaco as the center. You're coming from the outside and you're coming into the center. And it makes whatever you're doing in that center seem like the appropriate thing to do. It's natural, it's self-evident that you need to enact these ceremonies or do whatever it is you're doing in Chaco Canyon, maybe in order to keep the whole world in balance. And that makes some sense. So that's what I was talking about in that early work. And this, of course, got me to think a lot about what you can see in and around Chaco Canyon and things like lines of sight and long-distance visibility and how those might have been important in tying the whole Chacoan world together. So a lot of outlier great houses are up on high places, but not all of them. Some are down in valleys, but there are a lot of other kinds of features scattered around the Chacoan landscape that are often up on high places, like these at the end of West Mesa. And these features have occasionally been called shrines. Sometimes they've had other names, but one idea that the Chaco Project had back in the 70s was that these features on high places might have been used for signaling. So here, actually, the work of Tom Wines. Did Tom make it? I didn't see him earlier. Anyway, work of colleagues like Tom Wines is really instrumental in trying to see whether or not these features on high places could actually see one another. And so back in the 70s, because it was the 70s, they apparently did some really wild experiments involving bonfires and torches and things at night, driving around the San Juan Basin. They're wild stories. I don't know, maybe Wilkie Toll, who's also here, can tell you some of them later if he was involved in this. But I came along too late for those kind of shenanigans, unfortunately. But we have done a few things like flashing mirrors between some of the high places. And it turns out in some cases there's evidence for fire, but in other cases there's pretty good evidence that people could have been flashing a mineral called selenite. It's this shiny mineral, kind of micaceous, and it's around the Chaco world. And so rather than flash selenite, my colleague here, Doug Palmer, has taken a hand mirror, and we're out there and we're actually trying to see if we can flash and signal back and forth. And Doug has done a lot of experiments along the North Road and has basically shown that, yeah, you can link all the sites along the North Road. They can see each other. You can't really see a person because the sites are too far apart, but if you hold the mirror just right and flash it into the sun, you can signal. So why would people have been doing that? Well, we had an idea, my students and I had an idea that maybe one thing that's going on is people in Chaco Canyon in the center are trying to, or it's important to them to try to communicate with or signal to people throughout the Chacoan world. And this could have been for purposes of communication, like, hey, everybody, it's time for the big ceremony in 3 days. Or it could have just been a matter of needing to realize, if you're living in an outlier, that, yeah, I have a connection back to Chaco. So it's really hard to get enough people and enough permits to go out on this landscape and put people in every possible high place that we might want to put into our model. But together with a GIS wizard who's now employed at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, among other places, Kyle Basinski, we did a simulation inside of a computer. So basically, we took all of the data that we had on great houses, and that was, remember, over 200. And then we took all of the data that we had about these features that were on high places, and we tried to see what would happen if we modeled their intervisibility in a couple of different ways. So here's one of Kyle's really pretty graphics that I'm showing you. And this is basically everything in blue can be seen from Chaco Canyon, from either a feature or a great house in Chaco Canyon. Everything in red can be seen from outlier great houses, and everything in yellow can be seen from both. But looking at that may not tell you too much, but it is pretty to look at, isn't it? So you'll have to take my word for it that we also did some models, and I thought this might come out a little fuzzy, but we also did some things that are called ViewNet analysis. And what Kyle did actually, is he connected all the sites through line of sight inside the GIS, and then he tried to see if we take away those small sites in high places or if we add them, what happens. And what we learned was if we include these small sites in high places, these shrines as they're sometimes called, you get a really nice interconnection between Chaco Canyon and all of the surrounding sites. And so this works. Now, there are, of course, wrinkles and things that we need to understand better. And one of the things we need to understand better has to do with the fact that we don't know where all of those features in high places are. We only know where all the ones that Tom Wines mapped, and as well as a few others that have come to light through various projects over the years. But there's undoubtedly many, many, many more out there. And so it would be really great at some point to have a more complete database so that we could actually see whether this works further away from the canyon and whether there might be holes where people aren't dialed into line of sight. And if so, what does that mean, et cetera. Within outlier communities, we're also interested in what you could see. So great houses, as I said, are often up on high places. And here's one called the Whirlwind Lake Great House. It's up on a mesa, and it's overlooking a community. So you can see my husband here, Randy McGuire's scale for you on the Great House above, and my intrepid but newly demised Toyota Tacoma. It was totaled last week. I'm very distressed. So this is like a few years ago before it was totaled, and it's hanging out down there in the valley, and we're looking down across the valley. Well, we know from a really intensive survey mapping project that happened in this valley in association with the pipeline project a while back, we know where all the community sites are. So you would think that if you have a great house up on top and it's looking down across this valley, that it could be about surveillance, right? Like maybe the people at the great house want to be able to see everybody in the small sites, the habitation sites. Or maybe everybody in the habitation sites needs to see the people standing up on top of the Chaco Great House, and I don't know what they're doing, drinking cacao or something. They're doing something up there and you have to see them. So we took all of that data, and another former student, Tucker Robinson, did this model inside, again, a GIS, and plotted the view shed from the Whirlwind Great House and the community. All the little red dots are community sites, and you've got the Great House labeled there in the middle. It's in blue. And if you look at this, you can see that, yeah, a few of those red sites are in the green zone. You can see them, but an awful lot of them are actually in the black zone, and you can't see them. So it didn't really work that well. So we thought, what's going on? And it turns out that the sites that can see really well to the Great House are the sites at the edge, and they would be the sites that you would first encounter, or if you were first coming into the valley, you could see that Great House up there like a beacon going, hey, you are now in the Whirlwind community. But as you got closer to the Great House, the Great House actually goes away. It drops out of your view. So if there is something going on there in terms of signaling or something important in terms of being able to see the Great House, it seems to be talking to people who are not in your community rather than people who are in your community. So we've done this kind of modeling in some other communities as well, and what we see is a lot of variability. Sometimes it works great, sometimes it doesn't work. Does this vary over time? Does this vary depending on how close or far you are to Chaco? But we don't actually have, again, enough detailed data inside Great House communities to really look at this really broadly. So now I'm going to take you to another Great House community called Pierres, and this one is on the North Road, about 15 kilometers north of Chaco. It's one of the ones that we can signal to from Chaco Canyon. We can flash mirrors back and forth. And it's a really important one because it's on the North Road, and there are a lot of kind of unique features there that suggest that if you can imagine people maybe processing or walking along the North Road, this would have been an important kind of pass-through point. So here I'm showing you on the bottom, there's a mesa with two great houses on top, and you can see kind of a little pinnacle in the background, and there's one of these little funky sites up on top of that pinnacle. And then the top right view there, and I'm totally forgetting to use my pointer, but you can see, I'll point like this. The top right view is an aerial view of one of the great houses provided by Archaeology Southwest. So beautiful landscape, interesting great houses, be interesting to kind of model what's going on in the viewscape there and try to understand it. You can see, again, back to Pueblo Alto from here, so that all seems pretty important. So, you can go up to the Great House today and you look to the south, and here's what you see right now. You see a pump jack with a big truck next to it, and that is 700 meters away from the edge of the furthest south Great House. It is totally legal. It's on, these are BLM mineral rights, and the Great House itself and the Pierres community is inside of a zone that's called the Chaco Protection Sites Zone, or it's the Chaco Protection Sites. This is a 1983 law that basically said that a lot of the outliers, not all, but about 60 of them, are protected from any kind of development within the confines of the Great House. But remember, back in the 70s and 80s, all that we really knew was, yeah, there's a Great House, it's a dot on a map. This particular community is really well mapped and really well studied by folks like Bob Powers. So we know where all the small sites are, and so there's actually some state land that's protecting some of those sites as well, but it's not protecting the land adjacent. So the well pad is just right there. And you can even see when we were out there was a guy servicing the rig with a truck there. And you can see lots of rig roads. They're driving in and out. They're driving back and forth. If you go out to that pump, it gives you a little bit idea how close we are there. We're standing at that pump jack and we're looking back, and you can see the arrows that point to where the two great houses are, House A and House B. If you stand up on those great houses and you look around the horizon, here's what you see. And I realize the labeling might be a little fuzzy. They're numbers. It doesn't matter if you can't read them. But it turns out that basically all the land around the Pierres community has been leased for oil and gas production, and there are 11 oil and gas rigs within the viewshed of the Pierres great houses. I've done it like a 3D sort of with my iPhone, just look around, and it's kind of alarming to see them glinting in the sun. But I'm not going to show you that. I'm going to show you this map created again by my friend Kyle Basinski, where he took the data, the locational data for where the pump jacks are, which is actually available from the BLM, and put this on top of a topographic map. And so the red dots in the middle, those are the two great houses at Pierres, and all of the blue little balloon-looking things, those are all oil and gas mineral extraction rigs, equipment. And what's in yellow is all from the viewshed, inside the viewshed from Pierres. So this is pretty significant impact to the viewscape of the Pierres community. You guys probably all know, here's a map showing you just how much of the surrounding area has been leased. So what you're looking at here, I've cropped out the key just to make the map big enough so that you can see. But everything in blue has been leased by the Bureau of Land Management for oil and gas. Chaco Canyon is that kind of purple rectangle or purple shape there in the middle, and big outlier that I showed you earlier, Quinbiniola is there, Quinyaa is there, everything in blue has been leased. So that's a tremendous amount. That's pretty much all, right, of the area north of Chaco Canyon has been leased. So this greatly concerned me as a Chaco scholar. I also, as a Chaco scholar interested in people's experiences of landscape, was interested in kind of not just what you can see, but also what you can hear. And what you can hear on the Chaco landscape is something that not a lot of people have seriously delved into. There's been some experimental work, but again, I mean, until recently, it's been hard to kind of model this or replicate it in any way. But recently, again, I had some colleagues who developed a technique to do acoustical modeling if you had enough fine-grained topographic data, which we now have. We have great LiDAR data for the Pierres community. So, and we know that conch shell trumpets were a thing at Chaco. There have been some that were excavated, that were found. So what we did here was we pretended that we're a person standing on top of one of those Pierres great houses at dawn on the summer solstice, blowing a conch shell trumpet, and we modeled how far the sound would reach. And so everything in blue could be heard by the conch shell trumpet. And interestingly, that encompasses the entire community, which leads me to think that this is pretty cool. Maybe if you're in a Chacoan community, you need to be able to hear if somebody's blasting that trumpet. Maybe they're gonna call you for something. And we did this in one other community and it also worked. So we'd really like to have a lot more community data to do it in a lot of communities and see if this is really, a robust pattern or whether it's a one-off. But it was really intriguing kind of experimental test that we did. But of course, when you're out at Pierres today, you're not hearing conch shell trumpets, nor is it particularly quiet because Here's another rendering that my colleague Tim DeSmet did of the noise from the pump jacks. So Pierres is right there in the middle of this little island, and all of those red, glary-looking eyes, those are all of those same pump jacks that you saw previously depicted as blue balloons. And what my colleague Tim DeSmet did was he took an average of the sound of pump jacks, which again was data that was available online, and plotted that into the model and showed the reach of that noise. When we were out at Pierres the day that I took those photos that I showed you earlier, that pump jack was actually making a horrific racket. It was backfiring every few minutes. And when we first got out there, we thought somebody might be shooting at us, because we heard this bam, bam. And it turned out apparently it needed a muffler, which the BLM has supplied, but it's still a lot of noise, right? So as a Chaco scholar interested in sense of place and in experience on the landscape, this mineral production business has me gravely concerned. And I'm not alone. So 7 years ago now, this was during the Obama administration, mind you, the Park Service was also concerned about what was going on across the greater Chaco world. And a Park Service administrator by the name of Tom Lincoln reached out to my friend and colleague Steve Lexon and said, we as the park cannot say or do anything about this because we are also a government agency and the BLM is a government agency and we cannot really talk about this. It's not, in our job description. But you guys are academic researchers, so wouldn't it be great if you were to do some kind of a study of the greater Chaco landscape and give us some kind of tools that we could use and we could give to the BLM and the BIA and other agencies to use when they're trying to create management plans for things like oil and gas leasing, because there's so much that we don't know. And so Steve Lexon said, well, I'm gonna retire, I don't wanna do this. Well, actually he didn't say he wasn't gonna do it, but he called me up and he said, I'm gonna retire, why don't you do this instead? And I said, I'm not doing it without you, Steve. So he roped me into this, but without much persuasion needed. And then I called my friend and colleague Carrie Heitman, who's at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and she is a major player, controller of something called the Chaco Research Archive, which is a tremendous online database of all things Chaco. So the three of us together spent a series of time holding a series of meetings with various stakeholders and talking about what was important to the different constituencies across the greater Chaco landscape. And we ended up producing a white paper, which is now being used in legislation, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, and which the BLM now has that they can potentially use as a management tool. And the two biggest takeaways from the white paper, we documented a lot of the things that I've talked about here in various incarnations, and look at how much we don't know. But the two biggest takeaways are outlier great houses are not points in a vacuum. They have to be integrated into larger landscapes and spatial experiences to be understood. And the second one is actually the most important, I think. The importance of the Chacoan landscapes to descendant communities is really paramount here. And tribal consultation had not fully happened and still has not fully happened before this leasing took place. And so we try to make the point that, listen, it's all well and good for me as an archaeologist to say I'm really concerned about this, but at the end of the day, these are not my ancestors. These are the ancestors of the indigenous occupants of this place today. These are Pueblo and Diné ancestors, and these are people that need to be consulted and talked to before this goes on. So we wrote the white paper, but then we thought, well, let's do more, and we still had some funding, and so we thought, well, let's try to do something scholarly, something perhaps more accessible to the public than a white paper, which it's a management document, it's really thick and dense and what have you. So we had another meeting, and this one was at Chaco Canyon about 3 years ago, and we rather facetiously decided to title it The Greater Chaco Landscape, What We Know and What We Don't, and then we figured out, yeah, that actually is the title. So we held this meeting, and there were a tremendous number of players at this meeting. And as a result of all of this, we are doing an edited volume. So I'm just going to flash this. Don't freak out because you don't have to write this down or read it. But just to show you, these are all of the players and the topics that we covered. We're trying to think about all the different dimensions of the greater Chaco landscape that we don't understand well enough and that reach far beyond like a great house as a dot on a map. Okay, so that's what we're trying to do. And we have folks like G.B. Cornucopia writing about or talking about night skies. The other piece of this that we thought was really important, when we held our meeting, of course, when you do an edited volume, you usually hold a series of meetings and people write papers. But a lot of what we were talking about doesn't really lend itself that well to written papers. A lot of it's very visual, and we had a lot of beautiful images and things from various presentations, and we had people talking. So we decided to go ahead and film all of the speakers. And so this is ultimately going to be a book that is essentially a hybrid. University Press of Colorado with some subvention money from us is producing an open access volume that you can buy in hardback if you want to, or in paper if you want to, in which case you can navigate to the website, which is up right now, so you can write this down and go check it out if you want to. Or you can buy the ebook, in which case you can navigate seamlessly to the website. And on the website are, right now, videos of all of us giving our talks at this meeting. And the book will be finished in August 2020, and it'll be published in August 2020. So this is an unfinished website right now, but I have the full endorsement and permission of Darren Pratt, the press director, as well as all the other players to, yes, please share it. Please go there. Again, it will be open access, and you can hear all about it. But you know what? We hadn't gone nearly far enough, because some of the folks involved in our meeting, we had invited representatives from various Native American descendant communities to come. And so we, of course, at the end of the meeting are saying, well, we're going to write these papers and what have you. And my good friend Will Sosi said to me, he's a Dene archaeologist, and he said to me, you know, Ruth, we could write something, or you could show the film of us standing in this room at Chaco Canyon, but you know, from our tradition, it's much more appropriate if we talk about this sort of thing when we're out on the landscape. So is there any way that we could actually film something on Chaco, in Chaco, rather than doing it in a conference room? And it's much more appropriate in our tradition to be telling these stories orally, you know, not writing them. And we said, well, we still have some Park Service money left, so let's do that. So we went to Chaco with some of our friends from this meeting, and here you see some photos in October 2017 when I was out there with Will Sosi as well as Ernie Vayo from Acoma. And we worked with Larry Ruiz and Cloudy Ridge Productions from Durango, wonderful set of human beings and fantastic videographers. And what we did was we just asked them to talk about whatever they wanted to, but tell us about why Chaco is important from your perspective, for your group, for your tribe, for your pueblo. And Will also brought along a school teacher from Navajo Prep, as well as some of her students. And so he had a whole Q&A with the students about why is Chaco an important place. So we filmed all of this, and it's all this footage is up on the website. But of course, that's only 2 groups, so we needed to do more. So this past fall, we filmed with tribal representatives from Hopi and from Zuni. So you see here Curtis Quam, Octavius Seotua, and Presley Haskey, who are members of the Zuni Cultural Resources Advisory Team. And then you see a number of folks, 4 folks came from the Hopi Cultural Resources Advisory Task Team. And again, we spent several days with them in Chaco, and they shared with us many wonderful things. And they shared with us their deep connection to this place and their passionate conviction that we need to protect the greater Chaco landscape, Chaco Canyon itself, as well as all of the other surrounding outliers and the landscape itself. There was one particularly moving moment when we were all standing up above above Pueblo Bonito, on the way to Pueblo Bonito, and we stopped at one of these features, the stone circle, and Mr. Seotua stopped there, and he stood there for a long time, and then he said to us, people don't realize this stone circle is more important than any of that great house stuff down there. And he didn't elaborate, you know, but it tells me how little we as archaeologists understand about what's going on this greater landscape from a Native perspective. So these 2 film segments are not yet posted because we, of course, run them by the tribes first before we put anything online. But they will be there soon, and they'll be part of the final book. And this still isn't far enough, so we'd like to keep going. And so we'd like to continue to invite Native groups, descendant communities who are interested in participating in this project to contact us, or we'll contact you and come with us to Chaco, and we will continue to film and continue to add segments to the project as we move forward in time. And again, here's the website. So we feel like this is a really important piece of it, just lending a voice or providing the opportunity for the voices of Native people to be heard. And that's actually far more important than any of the other stuff that I showed you guys earlier. But meanwhile, of course, we're not working in a vacuum. None of this is happening in a vacuum. We're also collaborating with our good friends at NGOs like Archaeology Southwest Paul Reed, another archaeologist who has done a tremendous amount of work, and he's part of our group as well. He's working with us as well. But he's been one of the folks that was really instrumental in proposing the idea of a 10-mile protection zone around Chaco Cultural National Historic Park. And I think probably you all know your very wonderful representatives, Deb Haaland and Taurus Smalls and Ben Lujan, proposed this in the House as H.R. 2181, and it was passed by the House last October. And this bill is currently in the Senate. I understand that it's currently in the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. So that's where it sits right now. It hasn't yet been passed into law. If we do get it past the Senate, and if it is made into law, what it will do is everything inside the red line there, everything within a 10-mile buffer around the core of Chaco Culture Heritage Area, Chaco Cultural National Historical Park, that's what I was trying to say, will be protected from additional leasing, and any leases that have not yet been developed will not be allowed to be developed. So that doesn't affect at all leases that have already been granted. And I'm sad to tell you that something like 90% of the area has already been leased. So this is not like there's no more drills, it's just there's no more new drilling, okay? And I want you all to remember that even if this law is passed, and I hope it is passed and it will be a great win if it is passed, here's that same red circle juxtaposed against the greater Chaco world. So look at that. So think about that. So the 10-mile buffer was sort of like all of us putting our heads together and saying, we can't draw a line around the whole thing. Obviously, we can't stop oil and mineral production, and nor do we necessarily want to, but what can we protect? Maybe we can protect within 10 miles, and that does grab a lot. What we really need, though, we really need two things. We need the Native American consultation to happen, and we need it to happen appropriately, and before leases are granted, not after. And then we really need for the Bureau of Land Management to have a comprehensive management plan that takes into account all of the what are called sometimes cumulative adverse effects, the noise from the drill rigs and the light from the rigs at night and the unsightliness of them when they're right within the site of a great house, and the potential damage to things like the watersheds. We need all of that sort of thing taken into account. And when we don't even know where all the outlier communities are, what the extent of them are, or where all of the shrines or other small features are, we need to find that first and then grant the leases, not be just looking after the leases granted. Oh, gee, I hope we're not going to have to move the rig 5 feet because there's a site here that's actually important. So at this point in the talk, people usually say, this sounds really horrific, what can I do? Here's what you can do. If this concerns you, you can write and call. Actually, you guys don't need to write and call your New Mexico senators because they're the ones who are sponsoring the Senate bill, wonderful Udall and Heinrich. But if you're not a voter in the state of New Mexico, write and call your senators. And you know what? Call Udall and Heinrich too and tell them you support what they're doing. Tell them to support this bill. You can, and Paul Reed gave me this phone number and said to post it, you can call the Farmington BLM office and you can express your concern. Particularly, you can say, hey guys, don't grant any more leases until you've at least properly completed your Native American consulting, because you haven't done that. They are right now in the process of developing a resource management plan that supposedly will provide for this, but it hasn't. They're in the process of amending it, but it's not finished yet. Nothing is happening. We don't know where that's going, so more pressure is better. You can support NGOs like Arc Southwest. They have been a really major player in all of this, and they're in there with the lawyers. They're filing comments. They're doing things to formally participate in this resource management plan amendment process, far more than like you or I as individuals can do. So you can support them. You can share the knowledge with everybody tonight. If you take one thing away from this talk, you now know that Chaco doesn't stop at the edges of the national park, okay? Chaco's much bigger than that, and we need to understand it, and we need to protect it. And you can stay informed. That's what I have to say. Thank you so much for your attention.